Morning, oyster catchers. Okay, we're on Wednesday morning now, and we've actually reached chapter 15 of Tom's Midnight Garden. So, without further ado, I'm going to read this chapter and then let you know what I'd like you to do afterwards for your independent work. So, chapter 15 The View from the Wall. In following the course of Tom's historical researches and his reasoning, we have gone a little ahead upon the order of events, as Tom perceived them in the garden. The treehouse, in which he and Hattie quarrelled, was not built immediately after the episodes of the geese upon the lawn and the little girl in mourning. Indeed, on his next visit to the garden after those happenings, Tom thought for a while that he had lost Hattie for good. The garden appeared absolutely deserted. He called and searched through all the usual hiding places. He dashed round and around the trunk of the fir tree, imagining he had heard her slippers moving nimbly on the dry earth the other side, always evading him. So what do you think the word evading might mean? Perhaps have a little guess and we'll come back to that one later. Evading. But if Hattie had hidden, she had hidden better than ever before, and made the garden seem a green emptiness. He saw over the south wall a thread of smoke that mounted vertically into the soft, still summer air, and it occurred to him that Abel was perhaps tending his bonfire. He stopped dead by the orchard door, wondering whether he should thrust himself through it again. If Abel were the other side, he might provide some clue to Hattie's whereabouts. Suddenly the orchard door opened, and Hattie came through. At once all Tom's anxiety turned to annoyance, especially as Hattie looked far from anxious. Excited, rather, even pleased. Her face was flushed, and there was a bonfire smut on one cheek. She held something in her pinafore pocket. "Why didn't you answer?" Tom demanded. "Didn't you hear me? I called and I called and I called." "I was helping Abel with his bonfire. You could just have come and opened the orchard door and let me through. I like bonfires too." "You wouldn't have liked this bonfire. You wouldn't have liked what we were burning on it." She looked at him defiantly. "Well, what were you burning on it?" Now she lost courage and her eyes cast down, but finally said, "The bows and arrows. Oh, Tom, it was Abel who wanted to have them burnt." Tom was silent, guessing why Abel had wished it. He had always said that the bow might bring trouble to Hattie. And indeed it had done. Hattie went on, "And, as well as that, he wanted me to promise not to borrow any more knives from the kitchen, because they're so sharp and might cut and hurt me. And if I promised to let him burn the bow and arrows, and if I promised not to use the knives again, he said he'd give me a little knife all of my own." "What kind of knife?" She brought her hand out of her pinafore pocket and opened it. Across the palm lay a gaudy, cheap little penknife, ornamented with true love knots in blue. "He bought it at the fair to give to Susan, but she wouldn't have it from him because it's unlucky to have a knife from your sweetheart. So Abel gave it to me. It's a dear little knife." She turned it over lovingly. "Open it," ordered Tom. Hattie did so, and held it towards him so that he could see the blade. There was only one. "Well," Tom laughed shortly, "you certainly wouldn't cut yourself with that. You could just about cut butter with it, that's all." Hattie was still admiring the coloured decoration of the haft, but she said, "I've cut more than butter with it already. Come on, I'll show you." There was a touch of mystery and pride which she took Tom to one of the yew trees. It was the one called Matterhorn, and showed him the tree trunk on which were carved, or rather half scratched, half pressed, the initials H.M. Tom was wondering what surname the M stood for, but not liking to ask when Hattie said, "That means Hattie Melbourne has climbed this tree. With my knife I carved my initials on all the yew trees, except for Trixie, of course." It's very wrong to carve things on trees, said Tom, remembering suddenly to be severe. It's like leaving litter about. Hattie opened her eyes wide as though she had never heard of litter, and Tom could tell by her expression that she didn't think her carving could be wrong, on her trees anyway. She intended to go on doing it, if she liked, without telling him. And, Tom pointed out, you'll only get yourself into trouble if anyone sees those tree trunks. They'll see HM and they'll know they're your initials, and they'll know you're to blame. Now, if I wanted to carve my mark on a tree, which of course I wouldn't ever, but if I wanted to, I'd make a secret mark. He told her of his device of the long-term cat. For Tom Long, Hattie was envious. Melbourne, such a stupid name. There's Hattie, said Tom. You could draw a hat. Hattie's eyes sparkled. Only of course you mustn't. I've told you why not. And now, he said suddenly, tiring of talk, let's do something. Let's, agreed Hattie. So at once their play began again in the garden, and went on as though the garden and their games could never end. They went tree climbing again. It was a passion with them. As Hattie had mentioned not being able to climb Trixie, Tom taught her how to swarm. She did not learn easily, chiefly from a horror of dirtying her clothes so much that her aunt might notice and punish her. But after a while she learnt how to wind her arms and legs around the trunk and worm her way upwards. In the end, she climbed Trixie. She was triumphant. They played new games. Hattie found grasses of wild barley growing in the wilderness and picked them. She showed Tom how to nip the top out of the grass head and then replace it, and then holding the grass in one fist, she would knock it against it with the other, repeating, "Grandmother, grandmother, jump out of bed." On the word jump, she'd give a particularly hard knock and the top of the grass would spring out of its green bed into the air, and Hattie would laugh. And Tom too. Together they hunted for young frogs under the leaves of the strawberry bed. Abel says they suck the strawberries and set them hopping elsewhere. And once they had the sight of a toad in a crevice under the threshold stone of the greenhouse, like a stone himself, brown and dull and unmoving except for the breath in his sides. They teased the birds out of the garden. Tom was particularly good at surprising them and hoaxing the watchful jay. Yet they protected them against all comers too. Hattie let out the birds from the gooseberry wire and from under the strawberry nets, and then, when she was sure that Abel was far away, she unlatched the door of his sparrow trap. When any of the cousins came into the garden with a gun, Tom ran ahead, waving his arms and shouting to warn the birds. Wild pigeons rose heavily from the rows of peas where they had been browsing and made their way back to the safety of the wood. Nothing was ever shot unless you could count Tom himself, who once received a spatter of pellets through his middle. Hattie went pale, but Tom laughed. They tickled him. One day, when Tom and Hattie had been gazing at the sundial on the south wall, trying to make out how it told the time, they saw a wren light on one of the stone sunbeams above the dial, and then the beams projected a little way from the wall, disappear behind them. "Do you think there's a wren's nest there?" whispered Hattie, and Tom thought there well might be, but of course no one could be sure from the path below. "James once walked along the top of the sundial wall," said Hattie. "Well, I'm not going to do it," said Tom. "It'd be silly, not brave. That wall's far too high, and it'll be very narrowing along the top and far too dangerous." "Oh, Tom, I didn't mean you should walk it," said Hattie in dismay. "James only did it for a dare. Cousin Edgar dared him, and James did it. He walked the whole length, and then he climbed down, and then he fought Cousin Edgar, and then he was sick." And Cousin Hubert heard about it afterwards, and he was very angry because he said James might have fallen and broken his neck. Tom was silent, turning over turning over in his mind what Hattie just said. He was beginning to change his mind about climbing the wall because he saw that there could not be, for him, the danger that there had been for James. He might possibly fall off the wall, but a fall, even from such a height, could neither bruise nor break him. He said to Hattie, "I'm going to see if there really is a nest behind the sundial. I'm going to walk along the wall." "Oh, Tom!" The way in which Hattie said, "Oh, Tom!" made Tom feel warm and kind. He patted her hand. "Don't worry. It's all right for me." He climbed by means of the laddering branches of an espalier pear to the top of the wall. In spite of all he had told himself, he felt a pang of horror when he stood upright upon it. The wall top was so narrow, 9 inches, in some places weathered away to even less by the crumbling of brickwork. Quite bushy plants grew along it, over which Tom would have to step, and on either side of that narrow, hazardous path that the wall face went sheer and far. Down to the orchard on the other side, on the other down to the garden where Hattie stood, her pale face upturned to him. Tom knew, however, that he must not look down. If he were to keep his head and walk that top wall, he lifted his eyes and stepped resolutely forward. Very soon he was over the porchway into the orchard, and then over the vine against the wall, and then over the sundial. He could see that dead leaves and other airy garden rubbish had drifted into the space between the stone sunbeams and the wall. At one end they seemed much denser than elsewhere. Tom got upon his hands and knees on the wall top, and peering closely saw that this was indeed a wren's nest, with moss still greeny brown worked into it. He could see the little hole of entry. "There is a wren's nest," he called softly to Hattie. "But I daren't touch it. I daren't for her sake." "Come back and come down now, Tom." He stood upright again, intending to turn back as Hattie had said, but now, standing there, gazing freely about him, he was taken by a sudden joy. He began to pace along the wall like a king. Hattie was keeping step with him below and whispering up to him, but he paid no attention. He was so far above her in the garden altogether. He had thought himself high when he had climbed to the top of the yew trees, but he was higher now. In one sweep of the eye, he could see the whole layout of the garden and the boundaries of walls and hedges that enclosed it. He could see the house. There was Susan leaning from an upper window to blow a kiss to someone in the garden. Abel, he supposed. He could see into a courtyard of the house, a courtyard whose existence he never suspected before. He saw Edgar there, engaged in washing Pincher in the tin bath of soapy water. Pincher looked very clean and wretched, with his neck poked forward and his ears back and his tail down. Tom, in exhilaration, called to him, "Cheer up, Pincher!" Pincher heard him, or saw him, or even smelt him. It was difficult to tell which. Even under the lather his hackles rose, and he suddenly bolted from the bath and had to be chased round the yard and caught by Edgar, who was very much annoyed and covered with splashes of soap suds in the water. Tom saw beyond the garden and to the house, to a lane down which a horse and cart were plodding. Beyond the lane was a meadow, and then a meandering line that he knew must be the river. The river flowed past the meadow and reached the village, and past that. It reached a white handrailed bridge and slipped under it, and then away towards what pools and watermills and locks and ferries that Hattie and Tom knew nothing of. So the river slipped away into the distance, in the direction of Castleford and Ely and King's Lynn, to the grandeur of the sea. "What do you see beyond the garden, Tom?" Hattie whispered up to him, her curiosity having overcome her fears. "If you were up here, you'd see yourself," Tom said, and his words floated high over the garden. He could not tell her, could not hope to convey to her without her seeing it. The distance, in a flat countryside as this, Even a slight eminence gives a commanding view, as from a mountain peak. Tom, before, had known only the garden and very little beyond its limits. Now, from his wall top, he saw what seemed to be the whole world. "Tell me what you see," Hattie pleaded. "Well, from the top of the wall you can see the river," Tom began, "and if you follow the river with your eye—" "Yes, yes," whispered Hattie. Tom did not finish what he was saying, for at that moment Abel came round the corner of the trees. He was running. He rushed straight at Hattie. He set his hands upon her shoulders and pressed down, so that Tom saw her suddenly crumple to the ground in a kneeling position. Then he thrust something into her hand and, standing over her, began speaking in a lowered, quick voice. Tom heard Hattie's voice replying. She sounded frightened. He could not hear what either of them had said. In haste, Tom retraced his steps along the wall and climbed down again to the garden. By that time, Hattie was alone. "What on earth was the matter?" Tom asked. "Abel thought I was going to walk along the top of the wall, as James did," said Hattie. "He wanted to stop me because of the danger. I thought he was going to beat you. He made me kneel down on the path and swear on his Bible, swear never to climb the sundial and walk along it." "Was he very angry?" asked Tom. Hattie said slowly, "No, I think somehow he was frightened." "Frightened?" Tom frowned. "You mean that you were frightened? He was angry." "No, I was frightened a little, just because he was so quick and strong, but I'm sure he was frightened too, and much more frightened. When he made me take the Bible, his hands were all clammy and it shook." "Why did he suddenly think you might try to climb the wall?" asked Tom. "Because he saw me looking up at it that way, I suppose." "No, that couldn't be the reason," said Tom. "He was running when he came round the corner of the trees. He must have been running with his Bible in his hand before ever he came within sight of you." "Perhaps he heard me talking to you on top of the wall." "No, you only whispered, and he couldn't have heard me." By that Tom did not mean that he had spoken very quietly, for he hadn't. He meant that even if he'd shouted with all his strength, his voice could never have been heard by Abel. "Well then," said Hattie, "perhaps Susan saw me from the bedroom window and came down and told him of it." "Perhaps," said Tom. "I saw Susan at a window." But he was not satisfied with the explanation. At about this time, Hattie and Tom started on the building of the treehouse, and they soon forgot Abel's strange behaviour in their absorption in the work. Okay, that's chapter 15, quite a long chapter, and if you remember, we did stop at a word earlier on, and the word was evaded. I'm just trying to find where it is in the chapter. So evaded, or evading, actually it was evading. That's our word of the day, and that'll come up in the next bit when you press on the link. Okay, have a great day. See you later. Bye-bye.